Today we're going to be looking at displacement reactions to investigate the reactivity of metals. So I've got here 4 different metals. I've got magnesium, zinc, iron and copper, and then I've got their matching sulfate solution. So magnesium sulfate, zinc sulfate, iron sulfate and copper sulfate. And we're going to be comparing the reactivity of these 4 metals by reacting them with the different sulfate solutions. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at these reactions. So we can see here that I've got 3 strips of magnesium metal, so I can react it with zinc sulfate, iron sulfate and copper sulfate. 3 strips of zinc, so I can react it with the magnesium sulfate, the iron sulfate and the copper sulfate. 3 lumps of iron there to react with magnesium, zinc and copper sulfate. Then 3 strips of copper, which are going to react with magnesium sulfate, zinc sulfate and iron sulfate. Now you can see there that I've got the cross running through the centre of my table because there's no point in reacting magnesium with magnesium sulfate because it's the same ion that's involved there. So all I'm going to do is add just a few drops of the metal solution to the solid metal, and we're going to see whether or not there's a reaction. So let's start by adding the magnesium sulfate, and we're going to be adding that to the zinc, to the iron and the copper. And we want to see whether or not the zinc, the iron and the copper can displace the magnesium ions that are in the solution. So I'm just going to take my pipette, fill that up with magnesium sulfate, and let's add just a few drops to the zinc sulfate, to the zinc metal. Add a few drops to the iron metal. Add a few drops to the copper metal. Okay. Now we can't see very much going on here. There's no signs whatsoever of a reaction. There's no bubbling. There's no colour change. So that tells us that none of these metals, zinc, iron or copper, was able to displace the magnesium in the magnesium sulfate solution. Now let's add the zinc sulfate. So we're going to add the zinc sulfate to the magnesium, the iron and the copper. So add a couple of drops to the magnesium. Add a couple of drops to the iron. Add a couple of drops to the copper. And again, we're going to look for signs of a reaction that's taking place. So with the copper and the iron, there's no sign of a reaction that's taking place there. Let's zoom in a little bit and look at the magnesium and the zinc. And there's small signs of reaction there, so it's starting to have a little bit of bubbling. We'll come back and look at that a little bit later to see whether or not it's reacted anymore. We're now going to add the iron sulfate to our 3 metals, so to the magnesium, the zinc and the copper. So let's add a few drops to the magnesium metal. Straight away there we can see some fizzing and we can see the colour change of the magnesium. Let's add it to the zinc. We'll come back to that one to see whether or not we can see a reaction. And let's have a look at the copper. Okay, and finally, let's add the copper sulfate to each of our metals. So let's add the copper sulfate to the magnesium. Let's see if we get a reaction there. Let's add it to the zinc. Let's add it to the iron. So we can straight away see that the magnesium is reacting with the copper sulfate. We can also see that the copper sulfate solution has turned a black colour when it's reacting with the zinc. And if we look very carefully, we can actually see that the iron has also reacted with the copper sulfate solution, and we're actually seeing the colour of the copper metal starting to come through on the solution there. So let's just go back and have a look at a couple of the others which we weren't sure were reacting yet. So let's zoom in a little bit. So we can see just on the edge of the magnesium that's reacting with the zinc sulfate, it's just started to decolorise and starting to bubble a little bit. So the magnesium is reacting with the zinc sulfate, albeit very slowly. And if we look at the zinc reacting with the iron sulfate, again, it's started to show some bubbles, starting to change colour slightly, but it is quite a slow reaction. So what do these results tell us? Well, it tells us that magnesium is the most reactive because none of the other metals could displace magnesium when it was in solution, but the magnesium metal was able to displace the zinc, the iron, and the copper. The zinc is the next most reactive because it was able to displace iron and it was able to displace copper when they were in solution, but it was not able to displace the magnesium. The iron is our third most reactive. It wasn't able to displace the magnesium, it wasn't able to displace the zinc, but it was able to displace the copper, and we can see the copper colour of the granules there. And so copper is our least reactive. We can see it was not able to displace any of the other three metal ions when they were in solution. So there we go. We've had a look at the reactivity of magnesium, zinc, iron and copper. By using displacement reactions, we can come up with an order of reactivity for these four metals. So I hope you enjoyed watching that little demonstration of displacement reactions to compare the reactivity of different metals. What you also need to be able to do is write word and symbol equations, and at GCSE as well, write ionic equations for those reactions. See you next time.